All right, welcome to Module 1, Lesson 1, Identifying Integers and Their Opposites. If you have not done so, please make sure that you watch the vocabulary video before this that goes over positive numbers, negative numbers, opposites, and integers. It's going to help you throughout this lesson as we're going to be using those words as we go. So after this lesson and after our working class, so that's a key part there. Remember, it's not after this lesson will you be perfect at this, and it might not be after the lesson either, but these are what we want you to get to, but that doesn't mean you have to be able to do it after watching this video. This is just the intro. Right? So understand that positive and negative numbers describe quantities having opposite directions or values. Use positive and negative numbers to represent real-world situations and explain the meaning of zero in each situation. Identify positive and negative numbers on a number line and plot those positive and negative numbers on a number line. Because we're going to do a lot of plotting, I ask that you have red, blue, green, and black colored pencils. That will help us when we are plotting our numbers on our number line. All right, so here's our first problem. We're working with elevation, and it's important to note that when you're working with elevation, that 0 is a key part of working with elevation. Now, it doesn't say 0 though. You might look at a map and see that it says 0, but we have to understand what that means because in words we don't say, oh, this place is at 0 level, right? So what we refer to as sea level is actually represented by 0 on the number line. So here we have 0, but in real life it is sea level. So in words, for elevation, 0 means sea level. Okay, and it's important to remember that the elevation in this case is feet. I know you have it. I just need to mark it on here. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look and say, all right, if I am at Little Butte, I am at an elevation of 5 feet. And I'm actually going to use my blue pencil for Little Butte. And since I'm at 5 feet, so you also have to remember that the sign of the number tells you the direction from 0. And then the number tells you how far from 0. So everything is in regards to 0. I'm going to make my pencil a little smaller here when I write, but I'll make it bigger for my points. So here I have 5. 5 is positives because there's no sign in front of it. So positive tells me that it is going to be to the right of 0, that it's larger than 0. And then the 5 tells me that it's 5 spaces. So I count, I start at 0, I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now I know each of these is worth 1, so I only have to count by ones. And I know that this is Little Butte. And I write A because Little Butte is represented by A. Okay. So then now, Cradle Creek. Cradle Creek I'm actually going to do in red. Now again, look at the sign. You have a negative sign here. Since it's negative, it tells you you are going to the left. So I always start at 0. I always start at sea level. And now I'm going 5 spaces to the left. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Again, it's always important to make sure that each of your ticks on the number line, I know each of them represent 1 because it shows me this is 1, 2, 3. If this were 2 and this were 4, then each tick would represent 2 and I'd have to be more careful when I plot my points. Dinosaur Valley, I'm going to use my green, and that is actually C. I forgot to put my B for Cradle Creek. That's my fault. All right, and then now, again, we start at 0, and I'm going to the right because it's positive, and I'm going to the right 8 spaces. And I'll mark my C for Dinosaur Valley. All right, and then now I have my black colored pencil. It's going to represent Mesa Ridge. Again, this is a negative number, so this would be -9, so I start at 0, and I go 9 spaces to the left because it's negative. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, so then now I mark a D for Mesa Ridge. And then now you guys actually have your pencil. I don't have a pencil, so I'm just going to use purple. If you want to use purple because you have another color, that's fine, or any other color to represent Juniper Trail and E, that'll work. Why don't you try this one on your own and come back and check your spot. So you should have plotted your number here at -3 because the negative told you to go to the left of 0 and the 3 told you to do that in 3 spaces. So you have Juniper Trail at -3. Now, this actually goes left and right. I'm actually going to turn it because I know in a little bit we're going to be talking about elevations and what's closer and further. And when we talk about elevation, elevation is actually up and down. So I can actually take my number line and twist it like this, but I have to make sure that my negative numbers are down and my positive numbers are up. So it's not just left and right. Negative also tells us that we need to go down, and positive tells us that we would go up. So don't just get stuck in this left and right mode. Up and down is the case as well. So we already talked about B, about which number represents sea level, and it's 0 because 0 is in the smack dab middle of all the positive numbers and all the negative numbers. So we would say 0 represents sea level. And when I write my zeros, you'll notice that I actually put a slash through them so I know that it's a 0 and not an O. So when you look at that and you're like, what is she doing? That's what I'm doing. I'm putting that slash so you know that that's a 0. All right, which location is closest to sea level? So we have to remember that regardless of the direction, if it's closer to 0, that means it's fewer spaces away or fewer feet away in real life. So here, if I start at 0 and I go up into my positives, the first one I see is 5 feet away or 5 spaces away. Right? So I can show you that by using my pen, and it's going to be a little tricky here. So I'm going sideways, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But then now if I go down, I notice that it's only 1, 2, 3 spaces away before I get to my closest point. So even though it's negative, the closest location is actually Juniper Trail, that purple dot for me. Okay, so my answer here would be that Juniper Trail is closest to sea level. I know this because on a number line, -3 is closest to 0, which represents sea level. So even though we don't have sea level written on here, since we know sea level is shown by or represented by 0, we're looking for whatever number is closest to 0. Okay, which two locations are the same distance from sea level? So now here's where it's really important to know what we're talking about and what's going on. You're talking about how far away something is from 0, and now you want to know two things that are the same distance. Well, in order to be the same distance and both be positive, there would have to be multiple points on this line, and there's not. Okay, so I know that 5 is my first elevation, 5 feet is my first elevation on the positive side, and since there's not multiple points here, there's nothing that is, there are not two places that are 5 feet from 0. However, since this is 5 spaces away from 0, I can actually look at the opposite end and look at the negative numbers and say, okay, well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is actually, so Cradle Creek is actually 5 spaces away from 0 as well. It doesn't matter that one is above and one is below. It's just how many spaces. So we ignore the direction that it is. So we ignore the negative and positive, and we just look at how far. We just look at the number. So in this case, my answer to the question would be the two locations that are the same distance from zero, or I should say sea level, are, and that first one was Little Butte, and I know that because that's my blue dot, and I have it indicated by blue on the screen, and Cradle Creek. Okay, are the locations above or below sea level? Little Butte is 5 feet above sea level, and we know that because it's positive. And Cradle Creek, I'm running out of space here, is 5 feet below sea level. So again, I could have two things. I could have two elevations that were 5 feet above sea level. That is possible, but I don't have that as part of my data. I would have to have 2 points plotted here. So in this case, in order for them to both be the same distance from zero, one had to be positive and one had to be negative because I don't have any doubled spots. I don't have any double dots. And which location has the least elevation, and how do you know? So when we talk about the least elevation, we're talking about the lowest, the furthest down. So don't even think about least in terms of value. Think of least in terms of literal low. Literally being below and really low into something. So when we think about being really low and below, we think about people who are underwater typically. Again, I want to emphasize that just because you're on land doesn't mean that you can't be below sea level. There's actually places in the US that are below sea level, and you're actually on land. So keep that in mind, and don't just think that because it's not on water that it's above sea level. Regardless, for this one, we're looking at the lowest elevation, and that's why I flipped the number line. Oops, shouldn't have erased my dot there. My lowest elevation on the number line actually ends up being that 9. Let me try to erase these here. There we go. So here the lowest is this 9, this negative 9. So even though typically when we think of 9, we think of a number that is bigger than 3 and 5 and 8, it's still the lowest. 8 would actually be the highest. Okay, so the Mesa Ridge is actually the lowest elevation. So that would be my answer here. So Mesa Ridge is the lowest elevation. I know this because now to be the lowest, it has to be below 0. So in this case, I know this because it is the furthest away from 0 to the left or down on the number line. Okay, so again, everything is in relation to 0. And we really focus on counting the number of spaces and then knowing what that negative means. In terms of elevation, this means it's below sea level. So below sea level would have to be the lowest. Because if we're above sea level and somebody's below sea level, obviously they're below us. So think of somebody who's up on a mountaintop and somebody who is deep sea diving. That person that is deep sea diving is going to be at the lowest elevation. Even if they're only at 20 feet below sea level and that person on the mountaintop is, at thousands and thousands of feet, it's still talking about the lowest, right? And negatives, no matter what number they are always smaller than positives. All right, so here, I want you to actually try these on your own. Now I know, now you can see them, so we'll actually just go through and do this together. When you have word problems, it's important to use your word problem solving techniques. And in this case, we do RIDE. So we read, identify, determine a plan, and evaluate. So the question here, so when I read it, it says Morning Glory Stream is 7 feet below sea level. What number represents the elevation of Morning Glory Stream? So I highlight the question. Okay, so when I read the first thing I do is then highlight the question. What number represents the elevation of the morning glory stream? Then I identify important information. I box important numbers and I underline important words and I circle I don't want to say our action words, but our operation words or our to-do words. So what it's telling us to do. So in this case, morning glory stream is 7 feet below. Well, 7 is important. Below sea level is important because that tells me which way on the number line my number would go. And it also tells me since it's below sea level, it's less than 0 because sea level is 0. So I know my answer has to have a negative in it. And then what number represents the elevation? So I would actually here circle represents the elevation. That's what we're being told to do, is to represent the elevation with a number. So in this case, we know that 7 has to be one of those, has to be that number because that's how far it is from 0. And then because it's below sea level, I know that that is going to be represented by a negative number. So this has to be a -7. Okay, and then here it tells us to explain how to graph the elevation of morning glory stream on a number line. Now we don't have to highlight here because we're not trying to pull, it's telling us what to do. This isn't, yes, it's in words, but it's not a word problem in the sense of we have to pull information and figure it out. We're just being given directions. So here, again, I always start at 0. So that should be your first part of your sentence. I would start at 0 and then count. Now remember, the number tells us how far. So I would go 7 spaces, and then the sign tells us to the left or right. Since it was below sea level, it's negative, so that tells us that we have to go to the left or down, depending on our number line. So I would start at 0 and then count 7 spaces to the left or down. All right, moving on here. So I know that this is asking you to get a piece of graph paper. You do not need to do that. I actually gave you number lines in your notebook, so you can use those. So you're going to use your number line to find the opposites of 7, -6, 1, and 9. So now here, this is where we have the different colors coming in. So first what we're going to do is we're going to plot all these numbers. So I have 7 and it's positive. So I start at 0 and I go 7 spaces to the right and plot my point. Now to be an opposite, it has to be the same distance from 0 and it has to be in the opposite direction or the other direction. So in this case, it was 7 to the right. So 7 to the right. So the opposite would have to be 7 to the left. So I start at 0 and I count 7 spaces. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Notice the numbers are the same. The only thing that's different is the sign in front of it. Let's see if that works for -6. So now I'm going to get my blue. And here it's -6, so it's 6 to the left. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So the opposite has to be 6 to the right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Again, numbers are the same, but the signs are different. I'd like you to go ahead and try 1 and 9 on your own. All right, so here you should have noticed that 1 would have been here, and its opposite was -1. And then 9 was here, and its opposite was -9. So again, the number has to be the same because the number tells us how many spaces from 0, but because it's different directions, we know the sign has to be different. So it's literally telling you right there, different directions from 0, but the same spaces. So that number has to be the same, the sign just has to be different. Okay, so how does your number line show that 0 is its own opposite? Well, let's take a look at this. If I plot 0 on a number line, 0 is 0 spaces away from 0. It doesn't go left and it doesn't go right, okay? Now, if I wanted to plot the opposite, I would have to go 0 spaces from 0. Well, that's actually still 0. Another way to look at this is if you were to take your number line and bend it in half, your opposite points would line up. So like 1 and 1 would line up if you folded it in half. 6 and -6, 7 and -7, 9 and -9. They would all, if you fold that number line in half, they would all line up. And you know that to fold it in half, you have to fold it in the exact middle. And we said that exact middle is 0. So the opposites line up on top of one another. Well, in this case, 0, if we fold that in half and plot 0, it is on top of itself at 0. So if you would fold the number line, you can also see that it's its own opposite because of the fact that it creases or folds and meets up with its opposite at the exact same spot. All right, and then what is the opposite of 3? So what is the opposite of 3? Go ahead and take a minute and give it a shot and come back and check your answer. All right, so you should have found that 3 would be here, so it's 3 spaces away from 0 to the right. So 3 spaces away from 0 to the left would be -3. So the opposite of 3 is -3. All right, explain how your number line shows that 8 and 8 are opposites. And then explain how to use your number line to find the opposite of -6. Take a second, give them a shot, and then when you come back, check your answer. All right, so explain how the number line shows that 8 and 8 are opposites. Well, we can have 2 responses here. If I were to fold the number line in half at the exact middle, so 0, 8 and -8 would line up. If I plotted my points, 8 would be 8 spaces to the right or up, and -8 would be 8 spaces but to the left or down. Oops, making them the same distance from 0, but in opposite directions. And that's what opposites are. Okay, explain how to use your number line to find the opposite of -6. Since -6 is 6 spaces to the left of 0, I would start at 0 and count 6 spaces in the opposite direction, which would be right or up. And I should have had left or down. So it is to the left or down from 0. Okay. So again, it's always just counting the same number of spaces, just making sure that they are in opposite directions. So if one is down, then you have to plot the other one by going up. If one is right, you plot the other one by going left, but you have to count the same number of spaces. So if your number isn't the same when you plot those, if you plot a 3 and a 4, you did something wrong. All right, so positive and negative numbers can be used to represent real-world quantities. For example, 3 can represent a temperature that is 3 above 0. Negative 3 can represent a temperature that is 3 below 0. But both 3 and negative 3 are 3 units from 0. So they're both the same distance from 0, but one is warmer than 0 and one is colder than 0. Right? So you have this example here of Sandy who kept track of the temperature. And then what she did was she graphed those points. Right, and so here we have that, so graph the temperature from week 3 and its opposite. On a number line, what do the numbers represent? So you graph the value from week 3, which is negative 4. So we plot that down here, and then we plot its opposite of positive 4 up here. So the negative 4 represents a temperature that is 4 below 0, and the positive 4 represents a temperature that is 4 above 0. So that just tells you that not only is the number opposite, so 4 is opposite of negative 4, but then that 4 degrees warmer than 0 is opposite of 4 degrees colder than 0. Now we're going to talk about the opposite of the opposite. So we're getting a little crazy here. So if you look at week 1, we want to find the opposite of the opposite. Okay, so the value for week 5 is the opposite. So the value of week 5, so we're trying to find the value for week 5, and we know that it's the opposite of week 1. So it's the opposite of 1. So we have to find the opposite twice. It's a lot of opposites. So first we're going to plot our first value of negative 1. So we plotted that here. And then we find the opposite of that. Well, the opposite of negative 1 is 1. And then we want to find the opposite of that. Well, the opposite of positive 1 is negative 1. So if you think about it, there's only 2 directions on a number line, either right and left or up and down. And since there's only those 2 directions, and it has to be the same distance away, the opposite of the opposite, so we're looking at number 5 here, explain how you can find the opposite of the opposite. It has to be the same distance and the opposite direction of the opposite. Well, the opposite direction of left is right, but then I want the opposite of that, which is left. Well, isn't that where I started in the first place? So I know this is kind of confusing. It'll make more sense as we go, but the opposite of the opposite is always the number itself. Okay. All right, so you have a couple of problems here. You have your turn problems that I would like you to go ahead and try on your own. And then you also have the guided practice problems, numbers 1 through 11, that I would like you to try as well. All right, so try these your turn problems, come back, check your answers, and then the guided practice is what you're going to do on your own, and we'll check those when you come back to class. So pause and try these, and then come back and check your answers. All right, so the opposite here would have been 1, and the opposite here would have been negative 7. Okay, the opposite would have been negative 10, 5, and 0. And the opposite of 6 is 6. Okay, as always, if you have any questions, make sure to email me or write them down so we can go over them in class.